Hello everyone, today we're going to walk through the Orka demo at tryorka.com. One of the first things you do once you sign up is you'll receive a demo token, and this really helps you start the demo process. So click on your link when you receive your email, and the first thing you're going to want to do is paste in your token. I do recommend copy and paste, that way you don't mistype anything or have spaces or all those kinds of things. Once you do that, you're going to click login, and you're going to get this page, which basically is your first step into the Orka environment and the Orka demo. This demo is guided and will walk you through step by step how to do everything you need to do, so there's no need to know anything in advance or even understand how Orka works. The whole point of this is to experience Orka for the first time and to see how we use it as a solution for CI/CD builds with Apple hardware in the cloud. As you can see, it's a cloud presented by MacStadium. It's on Kubernetes, it's on Apple hardware, and this tutorial is going to take us through. So the next thing you're going to want to do is click Get Started. I just want to point out that for an overview, we have a step-by-step guide for 10 steps to actually going through this tutorial that will walk you through every piece of the puzzle. And then when you get to the end at next steps, and we'll talk about it when we get there, you have the ability to do additional things in the environment beyond the tutorial. So we'll click Get Started. The first thing you're going to see is the deploy cluster. So Orka is actually software that lays over the top of Apple hardware. What we're going to do here is real-time provision a cluster of Orka on an Apple Pro, and we want to press this button and watch it happen. So clicking deploy, it's kicked off the process. You see a progress bar now indicating the build is in progress. It does take a few minutes. We have to grab the resource, we have to apply Kubernetes to the cluster, and then install the Orka software on top of that. Once that's in place, you have a full-fledged environment that you can use for development. This page is also giving you a couple of simple steps you can use to understand what you're going to do and how you're going to navigate this tutorial. Alright, so now that the cluster provision is complete, you can click Next and move on into the tutorial. So the first thing we're going to see is a command line interface pop up. This is the way we interact with Orka. In a full Orka environment, you typically would use the CLI or an API to drive your system. The CLI is a pretty easy way to get started because it has contextual help and you can walk through it and it'll actually tell you how to do things. So when we look here, the first thing we're going to want to do is set up a user. Orka uses locally authenticated users. So we're going to do Orka user create and hit enter. And we're going to be asked for a username, a password, and to confirm that password. Once that's created, you'll get a success message, everything will light in green, and you'll see all the check marks. And now you can do an Orka login. Orka login will pre-populate your email because it knows what you put in, and you can enter your password. Once you're authenticated, it will provide you a token. That token will prevent you from having to log in over and over repeatedly. So if you're doing automated steps or automated actions in the future, you're not going to have to constantly challenge for the password. That token is revocable at any time, and it can be pulled back by an administrator. So once we've done this, we're going to hit next. Now that we are logged in, we can start issuing commands against the cluster. This resource section is going to have you interrogate your cluster to see what it looks like. In MacStadium, an Orka cluster is actually built out of Apple hardware, and each physical host serving as compute is actually considered a node, and it's also node in the context of a Kubernetes cluster referring to resources as a node. So when you deploy a VM, you're going to give it to that resource. So for the purposes of this demo, we're going to do an Orka node list to get a view of what our node looks like. As you can see, we're on a host called Mac Pro 16, and it has 24 CPU and 60 gig of RAM, and it's in a ready state, meaning it's up, it's running, it's good with the cluster and ready for Orka to use. So the next thing you're going to want to do with your cluster is to create a VM image. VM images are actually full weight containers, meaning we don't, while Orka does use Docker to build Mac OS, it is not a modified version of Mac OS. It is a full weight version of Mac OS that you can use to reference to create containerized Mac OS. So if you do this Orka image list command, you're going to see a couple of images that were provided in the demo to give you a way to start easily and quickly without having to upload your own. There's a Mojave Clean image. That's just basically the plain vanilla version of Mojave from Apple. It has nothing in it, and it is just a base image. And then we have a Mojave Xcode image here as well. That image contains an already loaded version of Xcode specific for this demo instance, because we're going to be walking you through a full CI/CD process with Jenkins to show you how you would do a sample iOS build, and we need a version of Xcode for that. So we've provided that here so you can see how that process works. In your normal environment, you would be required to bring your own Xcode, your own development licenses, and your own software. So now that we've done this part of the program, we go to deploying a VM. What we're going to want to do is basically define the virtual template for the resources that we want to apply to this VM image. So we're going to run an Orka VM create -v. We're giving it a name of Orka demo, just so we can easily identify it for what we're doing. We're giving it a base image of Mojave with Xcode. And we're defining it to have 6 counts of CPU. As you can see, it creates an image from that base, creates a wrapper around it, and begins to deploy on the node. We didn't specify a node here. It will pick a node for you if you don't specify a name. In this case, we have only one, so it's a bit redundant to specify. If you had a true Orka cluster with 3 or more nodes, you do have the option to specify a specific node to land your VM on or to reserve resources on, and it's just a way to make a more directed deployment of that VM. So we've gotten a message back that it's been created and deployed. So just for verification, we're going to run an Orka VM list. Orka VM list is just going to go out and find all the running instances that we have, the deployed instances, I should say. And as you can see, we have a new deployed instance of Orka demo with an ID and an owner. It does track the owner to the user that instantiated the VM. It tells you what node it's running on. It's assigned an IP address. And then critical to the next steps is there are some predefined ports mapped to this VM. You'll see here we have VNC, screen share, and SSH. VNC is available so that you can watch the pre-boot boot process of the Mac OS, so you can see how that goes, and you can access the Mac OS prior to other security features being enabled or disabled, such as screen share, which is usually a more performant way to access the desktop, but it's often blocked by default on the initial install of Mac OS. So typically the workflow is that you'll have to install Mac OS and then run through custom configurations to enable screen share, and then you'll be able to use screen share from there on out. That's why we provide both VNC and screen share. SSH is also enabled so that you can execute other tools and scripting and things like that to the Mac OS without having to visually land on the desktop. So we also want to make sure we note the port here, 59999. These ports will generate per VM. That'll connect you to the specific VM. So we're going to go next. The first thing we're going to do is connect to this VM and just verify that it's up and running and good and see what's happening. So if you notice here, we have several tabs. Mac OS VNC is the viewer to get to our environment. If you see here, port 5999 is available for VM1. If I click this, it's going to establish a VNC connection in this browser for you. At this point, you're going to want to expand this. It's confined to the space that it is. If you click full screen, it'll let you have full screen. You're going to type in the password admin. This is a pre-configured user on this image for this demo. Again, your normal image or the image that you were provided, you'd have to set up your users or set the users the way you wanted to. Once we log in with the user credentials, we are on the Apple desktop and we have all the normal functionality that you have in an Apple desktop. Again, it's a clean Mac OS image. In this case, we have loaded Xcode tools so that we can continue this demo. But here's Safari. You can see things working. Once you've kind of verified that your Mac OS is up and running, you're going to minimize this desktop again so you can get back to the tutorial, and you're going to click next to go to the steps where we're going to engage Jenkins. This is where we're going to really start to set up automation of a build pipeline and see how this works. When you click next, you're going to be directed to start configuring Jenkins. So if you will click on the Jenkins tab here, you're going to get a dedicated instance of Jenkins. We do have a predefined pipeline with an iOS sample build in it that we're going to play with here and watch run on this VNC. So the first thing you're going to want to do is go to Manage Jenkins. And again, I'm following the instructions here. If you're familiar with Jenkins, feel free to jump in. But basically what we're going to do is utilize the pre-configured Jenkins instance to connect and to manage this build. So we're going to click on Manage Jenkins. We're going to go into Configure System, and then we're going to scroll down to the cloud portion of that configuration. The cloud portion of the configuration has an Orka Cloud plugin. So we have purpose-built a Jenkins plugin for Orka that we recommend anybody using Jenkins use. It is opinionated as to how to use Orka correctly and how to orchestrate your build pipelines. And it also has all the predefined components that you're going to need to connect and use it well. So if you look down here, the first thing you're going to do is go to the username and password fields for credentials, and you're going to click Add, and you're going to click Jenkins. At this point, you want to put in your username and your password. And we're going to just call it Orka Credentials so we know what it is, and we're going to click Add. So again, when we come back here, that's been added. I want to pick my Orka credentials. The first part of this plugin is asking me what credentials do I need to establish a connection to my Orka API endpoint in my cluster. Again, Orka is an app that lives inside of a Kubernetes cluster that really has a opinionated view of how to manage that cluster for Mac OS and how to use it for Mac OS. So this API server is your interface to that, and that helps you run all additional Orka commands. So here I'm providing my credentials to that and establishing a connection to that endpoint. And the next thing we're going to want to do is make sure and confirm that the VM that we want to use is in place and that we have the credentials correctly configured for that, because again, once Orka creates a VM, it's going to connect via SSH via the credentials that we provided for. This is that admin user that we saw earlier, and You can specify other things like the number of executors that you want to run per build. You can change the idle time, a couple of configurable tools like that. When you're ready, you hit save, and that will lock these settings in. You should be able to verify all these settings also right here in the tutorial with this snapshot. It kind of gives you an overview of what you should have. Just make sure everything you put in matches that, and then go to next. Also, a quick note, if you notice I've been scrolling around in here, it's a split pane demo, so you have the view area and the instruction area. You have the ability to scroll up and down. Just know if you don't see a next button, there's probably more content somewhere. The buttons exist on the top and the bottom for your convenience. So one of the things we're going to want to do before we start this process is to go back here and do an Orka VM list. Now, as we expect, there is the one and only one VM. That is the one that we created earlier. Now, what we want to see when we go back into Jenkins is that it's going to start a build for us, and Jenkins is using Orka in an ephemeral way, meaning it's going to create a VM for the purpose of the build, run the build, and then destroy that. So it will make the most use of the resources it has. So the first thing we're going to do is go back here and click build on. It's going to schedule a build. In just a second we should see a build in queue, and it takes about 10 seconds for that to pop up. And then, as we see over here, we've got a pipeline started running our iOS build. The status indicator starts to flash. At this point, we're going to go back and we're going to check on our Orka VM list to see what's happening. So head back to the command line, and we should see that Jenkins has actually created another VM based off that template. As you can see, it's got a different VNC port, a different screen share port, a different SSH port. It's using the same resource profile that our previous instance was using. Just kind of a note in the background, most of our nodes are 12 core Mac Pros, so in this particular demo we've taken, you know, half the resources on our first instance, and we've spun up another one with the other half of the resources. You can carve those up in the ways that make most sense to your build, and as you have more nodes you can spread them out. But we go back to Jenkins, we're going to see it working through the build. When we get done here, we're going to have a green dot for success, and then we'll move on to the next steps where we actually look at what the pipeline's done. Okay, so we've gotten a green dot. That means we had success, the build was good, no problems, sunny skies, everything's great. The next thing we're going to want to do is head on to the next page of the tutorial. At this point, if we go back to the CLI just real quick and do another Orka VM list, you're going to notice that your container was destroyed, the build was completed, it's all done, it's all gone, and you're back to the one manual container that you created that Jenkins doesn't affect. So, you know, per the instructions here, what they're wanting us to do now is use another VM to test out this build that we've created. So we're going to go to this long-standing VM that we have, the one that's not ephemeral, and we're going to VNC into it, and then we're going to go to use a shortcut to get to our Jenkins instance here, download it, and run it in the simulator. So we go back to Mac OS, we open the screen. I'm logged in from before because I never logged out on this particular VM. If you open Safari, we've created a convenient shortcut for the dashboard, so you don't need to remember what's in the tutorial, but it's in the tutorial if you can't remember. If you click on that, it goes to the Jenkins cluster you have access to. You're going to click on that pipeline, and you're going to see this simulator app zip file. This is the build artifact from your previous build. If you click on that, you're going to see that it pops in Safari and downloads to the local system. So at this point, we have the local build delivered to this machine. We're going to open up the simulator. That's going to load, and we're going to have our simulated iPhone 6s come up. once it is loaded, and while it's loading, I'm going to go into our downloads folder here. And we see that we have this artifact from our build. That's what we're going to do. So we're going to right click on this, and we're going to share that with our simulator, which gives the simulator access to the build artifact. You can see it loading. It's ready. Now I can click over. I'm going to go ahead and close this. And I can open it up on the simulation. And now I've got our iOS game that we just built with Jenkins on Orka in an ephemeral container. You can drag these numbers around. It's a drag and drop game. Trying to create a score. Reset. You can test. You can play. But we've just completed a build. So, you know, it's pretty straightforward, but a lot's happening in the background, right? Orka's been using Kubernetes to actually instantiate a real-time container pod with macOS inside of it, have your Jenkins resources connected to it, use that for build, clean up after itself, have that instance available to you for test, and you can see all the things you've built and done. Now, when you're done playing with the app here, you can shut the simulator down, and you can minimize the screen. At the end of that, you've pretty much gone through a full iOS build here with me with the Orka cluster. At this point, you know, the demo gives you a couple hours to play around, so you're able to type Orka help, and that's going to give you a full list of commands. Orka's an interesting environment in that it is a really, really good way to build with macOS, and it's a really, really ephemeral forward way to use CI/CD. So it's a little bit of a learning curve for some people because a lot of folks are coming from a bare metal world or a VM world where there's long-lived VMs and they're using scripts to manage that or to clean up after this. This really starts with the idea that you shouldn't have to do all that work. You should simply let the system create the resources at the time you need them for your build and then throw them away. That's part of the power and the convenience of Orka, and the speed of it, quite frankly, is the fact that it's saving you a lot of that configuration and setup time. If you look at the list of things you can do with Orka, there's a lot more to sort of experiment around with in this demo. You can create and list and do all the normal user creation steps, but there's a lot to look at on the node. There's something that if you're familiar with Kubernetes is worth playing around with after you finish the basic iOS build, and it's this sandbox capability. It requires a license key, but what it would let you do is designate this node as a native Kubernetes resource. At that point, you could actually go through processes and steps that are outlined in the Orka documentation, where you could use kube control commands to do anything you would normally do in Kubernetes. Again, in the demo, this is restricted, but in a normal Orka cluster, you have both a Orka side of the house, which lets you do the macOS specific things, and you have a Kubernetes side of the house, which lets you do any kind of pod or container that you're normally used to engaging with. This can be super helpful if you have, you know, command and control structures or artifact repositories or other systems that you like to run alongside your builders that can live side by side in that environment, so that you don't have to have a build farm and then also spin up a separate server farm for other things. You can look at the VM commands. There's the concept of attaching a disk. A lot of folks have a need to persist things between builds. Attached disk is a great way to manage that. And then a wide array of commands. One that's pretty interesting here is scale up or down. That lets you basically specify in a Kubernetes-like way the number of pods to scale up to, 7, 8, 9, and it'll start scaling across the cluster. You can also do live commits and snapshots. Now, commits and snapshots in Orka are kind of an interesting thing. it's sort of a Docker Kubernetes mentality of saving state. If you commit, you're basically saving changes to the container or the base image back to the original base, and that changes it. If you want to open a VM, put a lot of tooling into it, and then have a different version of that VM, you do a save, and that save gives you the option of having a second image now with all the things you changed in it. So then you can have a clean image and a modified image. You can repeat that process over and over and have as many images as you want. So if you're used to using stuff like Terraform and Packer, it's a good way to kind of have multiple sources for description for automation in the future. Again, I highly recommend going through a lot of these commands and seeing what you can do, and kicking around the Orka environment to make sure you understand it. And once you get your head around that and like all of those things, we would love for you to pop on over and talk to us about getting a full cluster. That's kind of it for the demo. If you are done with it, it's nice to log out. That closes your session. We'll take the cluster back, clean it up, and save it for another day. Thanks for trying Orka.